the question we're asking is microinsurance profitable? Very simply, does the premium outweigh the costs that you have to incur in the business? And go around the world and looked at 20 firms, 20 firms in depth, although we looked at many, many more, but 20 in depth, where we looked at a minimum of 3 years of financial data, basically profit and loss statements on those firms, to determine if they were either profitable or not profitable, or trending to profitability or not trending to profitability. So what makes a business case? Okay, we think that once we get these financial data, then we thought, well, let's look at what's driving these outcomes. And we think there are 8 things. The first 5 are essentially the kind of traditional business planning factors that anybody would do when they're thinking about a business and coming up with a concept for a business. So we're going to decide what's our business model. We're going to decide what product we're going to sell, what distribution channel are we going to use. In this case, are we subsidized by a donor or government? And also, very specifically to microinsurance, how are we going to enroll people? Is it going to be mandatory or voluntary? That's a pre-operational phase. And then in our business plan, we might project how many people will enroll and how much premium we'll earn. And it turns out that scale ends up being the single most important driver of business case in microinsurance. Everybody overestimates demand. Some people confuse demand and need. But scale ends up being the most important factor, and that's what I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about that today. Once a program's operational, other factors go to work on it, the competitive environment, and over time, you'll see things like government interventions and the maturity of the market and product life cycles also work to change the business case for any particular program. So, data point number 1. When we say microinsurance, just how micro is micro, right? And to make that point, I'm going to tell you that in the United States, a health insurance premium on average for one person is $4,250. So what about a micro premium? Now, I thought when I originally thought of this, I thought I'd do it actually proportionally, but if I did, you wouldn't be able to see it. Because in Kenya, we're talking about an average premium per person per year of $6. That's compared to $4,250. I can't even do the math, but in India we're talking about $3 per person per year. So it's something like we have in the US 1,500 times more premium to work with, right? So the question is, how do I make a meal out of those tiny slices? How do I make a business out of such small premium? You might say to yourself, well, of course the benefits are less, right? I mean, you saw Barbara's examples. Well, yeah, the benefits are less, that's true. But what about the cost of transacting the business? Because the guy that gets the big slice, the guys that get the little slices have to do exactly the same tasks. They have to collect premium. They have to pay claims. They have to provide services. Exactly the same tasks that the guy that gets the big slices. And it turns out that the crux, the heart of the matter for microinsurance as a business is this problem right here. Traditionally, we're taught in insurance to build a price for insurance roughly proportional to this slice again. We'll spend the most of our premium on claims, then the next amount on administration and selling, distribution, and then leave a little bit for our profit margin, right? So what happens when you get such a tiny slice to work with? What happens is you get a distortion of these outcomes. You'll hear me today, by the way, talk about claims ratio, and that ratio there, or proportionality, is the claims ratio is simply the claims in relationship to the premium. So this is a rough representation of that. So what happens when you have a tiny slice? We get an upside down triangle. On average, the micro health programs we looked at, right, spent more on administration than they spent on benefits and lost money doing it. And the reason for that was that they had such a small amount of premium to work with and so many services to provide. It wasn't because they were greedy or any other thing, but they were basically inefficient. They didn't have the efficiency with a $5 premium to deliver these services. A little formula for you. Another way to think about business case. To make it in this business of microinsurance is hugely leveraged to scale. You have to have massive scale and minimum costs, because that's the trick, right? So we have to get as many people covered as possible. The other way we could attack this is we could have a higher premium, right? But Barbara just got through telling us we got to have these really affordable, incredibly tiny premiums. So that's hard to do, right? But it would be one solution. If we could get donors to give us money to subsidize these premiums, that would solve the problem. Or again, just get millions and millions of people so we get the scale. Then the other way we can attack it is bring down the fixed costs. And you'll see today, I'll talk about some business models that are able to help bring down fixed costs. Or bring down the variable cost, the transactional cost, which gets into the whole technology question. Now, sometimes what you see is the way that businesses approach this, the way that they fix the problem, is to make this number very small. And that gets a little controversial, okay? But everything I show you today is going to be working off one of these factors, in an attempt to make this equation balance out. Okay, this is India. I'm showing you here the difficulty. This is again relating to distribution enrollment and how it does or does not produce scale. Okay, one of our findings is that voluntary enrollment, particularly in MFI distribution channels, does not yield sufficient scale. In India, you can see the average size of a public plan is 4 million lives. The average size of a health microinsurance private plan is 70,000 lives, which is in India is tiny and too small to make a business. Two things happen. I'm sorry. How does that come about? If you look on the left side of the chart, you can see the public plans up at the top, the ones that have scale. They approach very broad distribution channels, whole districts, whole villages, whole trade groups. So a very broad distribution channel. And they approach the channel with a group enrollment. So they get a broad channel and penetrate it at a high percentage. The problem with the MFI distribution, particularly when it's voluntary, which are the lower scaled examples there, they're doing individual enrollments in what for India are small channels, let's say 100,000 MFI members, doing a voluntary enrollment and getting, say in that bottom example, 18% of a small population base. Doesn't yield a business case. And why doesn't it? Look at the cost, right? The average cost in India to administer a private health microinsurance program is over $2.50 per life per year. The average cost on the public side is 70-something cents. And that's strictly a function of scale and the efficiency of having a larger group. Okay? Our report back from India on microhealth insurance is not a happy one. We found exactly 0 programs that were profitable, none. And let me be very specific though. I'm talking about private programs without subsidy. And I'm also talking about comprehensive health insurance. There are other kinds of health insurance like hospital cash, which can be profitable, but the attempt by private microinsurers to offer comprehensive health insurance on an unsubsidized basis has produced no examples of sustainable businesses in India. And India is the country with the highest concentration of health microinsurance, the longest history, longest track record in the world. So it's a little depressing, right? Kenya was a little bit different story. Remember in Kenya we had about twice as much premium to work with. We had $6 instead of $3, so it was actually a little bit more proportional. The outcomes were a little bit better, although still not positive. Also in Kenya, there's a government program, in this case it's the National Health Insurance Fund, which dwarfs the private guys. 3 million of the poor in Kenya are in the national program and 300,000 are in private programs. Interesting point here I want to bring out is that this is true in India, and in Kenya the public program is inpatient only. So you would think if you're going back to those competitive dynamics that we looked at the previous slide, and you're a private operator, you say to yourself, well, let me offer outpatient, because I can't compete with the public sector program with that subsidy. I can't compete with somebody, and this government is willing to live with a 250% loss ratio year after year after year. And the government, and they'll tell you this, they don't care about that. This is an explicit subsidy. So I can't compete against that. So we ask them, why don't you offer outpatient? Right? Wouldn't that make sense? To complement rather than compete with the government? Okay, it makes sense to me. So their answer is, well, their answer is it's impossible, it costs too much, because they say to me, Rick, look, for every inpatient hospitalization, there are 20 or 30 outpatient events, right? We all know that's how it works. So what we're saying about that cost issue is we're going to take your transactions and multiply them. Your business processes, multiply them by 20 or 30 or 40 times. And every one of those is an instance where you have to manage eligibility, where you have to manage a potential fraud event, where you have to manage a provider transaction, make a payment. That only exacerbates their problem because their cost structure is so inefficient. And that's the reason why, despite the fact that it makes sense from a market dynamic point of view, that you look all over the world, you'll only see a handful of micro outpatient programs. And most of those are donor supported, and some of them are really interesting and exciting, by the way. Life insurance is a much more positive story. Okay, win-win-win. This is Philippines. I'm going to go through it quickly, but insurers are making money. You can see they've got like a 25% margin. Distributors are making money. We went into 6 MFIs in the Philippines. These guys aren't doing cost accounting for their insurance, so we did it for them. We went in and did cost studies on what resources they were using to sell and service insurance. Every single one of them made money. I could put up a slide for Colombia that would show you exactly the same result. Life insurance here, win-win-win. There's an unambiguous business case, okay? But let's make it a little more interesting than that. So this is Colombia. Interesting difference between Colombia and the Philippines. In Colombia, the micro insurance business emanates from commercial insurance companies. It doesn't come necessarily from NGOs or MFIs or cooperatives, although they use some of them as distributors. The big guys, the insurance companies themselves, are the ones that are promoting microinsurance. They're the champions of microinsurance in Colombia. Okay? Secondly, they're using some interesting distribution channels, and Barbara touched on a little bit. This public utility channel, where they do the door-to-door sales, has yielded 46% of the premium in 2012 in all of life microinsurance in Colombia came from the public utility channel, while only 14% came from MFIs, which, globally, MFIs are probably the most typical channel, but not in Colombia. something else that's interesting. See here that only 22% of the lives come from the utility channel, whereas the MFIs have the majority of the lives, because the premium per policy sold in the utility channel is double what can be sold in the MFI channel. So you're starting to see what the insurers start to see, and that is that the MFI channel is a useful channel, and all of them use it. But it's not the channel that drove growth in Colombia. And part of the reason is the MFI channel is constrained to, in some ways, to sell complicated products and complex products like funeral or certainly health insurance or high-priced products, because the people that loan officers are out there and their core business is loans, and to ask them to sell something that is complicated or expensive gets to be challenging. So that's one of the constraints of the MFI channel. Okay, so that's Colombia, interesting story. And last point on Colombia is it's material to the results of those insurers. 12% of the profits of these large commercial life insurance companies that we studied in Colombia, 12% of their bottom line came from microinsurance. That's material. It's relevant to them. That's part of the business case. Quick point on brokers. We also studied two brokers that weren't standalones. The last two were standalones, okay? We studied two brokers that were embedded or part of larger commercial firms. Aon in Bolivia, Star in Ghana. Guess what? They got to profitability a lot faster. Why? Because their cost structure was lower. See here? Cost structure is 68 cents a life versus for the guys that were doing micro only, 268. That's the scale issue. Doing microinsurance from an existing commercial firm, remember we saw Colombia too, is a shorter path. It's not the only path, but a quicker path to a business case than doing it standalone. That's the lesson of these brokers. Okay, Philippines, and this will be wrapping up. Really interesting story in the Philippines. We wanted to study the effect of competition in microinsurance. It's hard to do because there are so few places in the world where the microinsurance markets are mature enough to study competition. Philippines is one place you can do that, or at least one place you can do that. The market's been active for 15, maybe 20 years, I think. And what you see in these two charts, first of all, you see a beautiful growth curve. We used to call this a hockey stick, that kind of exponential growth. These firms went from like 20 million in premium to 55 million in premium just during the time we studied them. Great. What happened at the same time? The loss ratios went up from 20% to 46%. Now, when they were sitting back in 2008, and they were all kind of sitting on their own islands, insulated from competition, and they could sell a product with a 20% loss ratio, they probably thought they had it great. But during this same period of time, this is a very, very competitive, and there's probably people in this room that know this better than I, very competitive MFI market. Well, what happened was MFI started to not only compete directly with each other, like there'd be an MFI on the street corner here and one here, and they're both selling insurance. And they started to see insurance as part of their competitive portfolio. And people would walk into one MFI and say, I want to open a savings account and get insurance. What's the cost? And then they'd go over to cross the street and go in this one and say, what are you offering? Well, the effect of that competition is right here, because what happened was everybody had to raise the benefits they were offering. This is the direct result of competition. And some might argue an improvement in what the members were getting. But it was a win-win, because at the same time that happened, they still had a healthy profit margin, and they got this beautiful growth curve. So one of our conclusions is, one of our 7 conclusions here is that competition in maturing microinsurance markets is a good thing, and it rationalizes pricing. So with that, I'll conclude. Thanks.